I tend to believe that we're still incredibly early in the global monetization of Bitcoin. I think most people really aren't paying attention to it at all. And I think most people saving for the future or investing for the future are kind of just sleepwalking.
What's going on? It's Sean with the Bitcoin Bros. We have another interview for you today. We've been pumping out these interviews. And who are we interviewing today? We're interviewing the newly appointed director for Semler Scientific, Joe Burnett. Joe goes into some detail on what's going on over on the Semler team. They're continuing to buy Bitcoin. They have some goals by the end of 2027 to get to 105,000 Bitcoin. You don't want to miss this interview. Let's get to it. This is Sean with the Bitcoin Bros, and we got Joe Burnett, the newly appointed director of the Bitcoin strategy for Semler Scientific. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us today, Joe. Welcome to the channel.
Thanks, Sean, for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's jump straight into it. So firstly, once again, congratulations on your new appointment as the director of the Bitcoin treasury strategy at Semler. With the latest acquisition to acquire about 187 Bitcoin, Semler is now holding 4,636 Bitcoin. And over this time of this Bitcoin strategy, Eric Semler has been very vocal as a Bitcoin advocate, and with the overall company being the second company to adopt a Bitcoin strategy. Can you speak to how this Bitcoin acquisition strategy will change, if anything will change, with you now coming on board to the Semler team?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be here. Excited to be a part of the Semler Scientific Bitcoin team. I joined the Semler team last week officially. It was Monday of last week, so 1 week into the role. And I definitely do think that the Bitcoin strategy will evolve now that I've become part of the team. Currently, we have about 4 steps or 4 ways that we intend to accumulate Bitcoin that we've publicly disclosed. And we probably have about a dozen or so alternative, more creative ways that we're thinking about or pondering that we may explore in the future to accumulate Bitcoin. But I can go through the 4 core parts of our Bitcoin accumulation strategy, and then we can kind of go from there maybe. So the first part is our common equity ATM. This is kind of the main prong that almost all of these Bitcoin treasury companies have been leaning in towards, right? They typically, in a bull market like we're in right now, a lot of these companies trade at a premium to the underlying Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And so it's accretive for these companies to issue new common equity shares and then use the proceeds from those shares, use the dollars that they raised to buy more Bitcoin. And so that's one of our main, ways that we have been able to accumulate Bitcoin in the past, and that we plan to accumulate Bitcoin in the future. I think Semler is a bit unique in regards to this specific point for one pretty important reason. It's that Semler actually has a valuable healthcare business that's tied or in addition to the Bitcoin on Semler's balance sheet, right? So if you actually look back at the history of Semler Scientific, Semler back in 2021 had about a $1 billion market cap. And this was before they adopted the Bitcoin treasury strategy. And this was all built on a viable, real, valuable healthcare business. Obviously, the healthcare business was booming back then. Its growth started to slow. It came into regulatory issues, and that's why they eventually pivoted towards a Bitcoin treasury strategy. But today, we still have this, healthcare business that has historically been profitable in addition to the Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And I think having that actual profitable healthcare business in addition to just a large treasury full of Bitcoin kind of makes Semler unique in the sense that, okay, maybe there might be a more sustainable premium over the underlying Bitcoin on the balance sheet, which might enable us to churn that common equity ATM when other people in the market might not be able to. So that's point 1. Longer point, I'll quickly go through the next 3 points. Point 2 is convertible debt, right? So this was done by Semler earlier this year, where we issue a convertible note obviously before I joined the team, and buy more Bitcoin. We did a $100 million convertible note, and the proceeds were used to buy $100 million worth of Bitcoin. The convertible note to Bitcoin market and product is really interesting, and it was kind of obviously created by Michael Saylor. And part of the reason that it's so interesting is the interest rate on a lot of these convertible notes is close to zero or very low compared to what a normal individual might get on a normal loan. And the reason is because these convertible notes act almost as call options with downside protection for the people that buy these convertible notes. And so, because companies like Strategy and Semler Scientific, their stocks are so volatile, the options market is very valuable because the stocks are volatile. And so that's why these convertible notes actually can have a relatively low interest rate, because the stocks are so incredibly volatile. The people that buy these convertible notes can then immediately sell call options, kind of hedge their position, and basically it's why the interest rates on these convertible notes are relatively low. For example, Semler's is about 4%. Strategy is close to 0% or at 0% on some of their convertible notes. So convertible notes is another way that we plan to raise money to accumulate more Bitcoin. The third potential strategy would be preferred equity, right? It's something that we're considering to explore. Obviously, Strategy has started to really dive deep into the preferred equity market, and it's something that I think we'll be able to do at some point as well. And then the fourth and final point for this one is cash flow from our operating business, right? Unlike some of the other Bitcoin treasury companies that may have a very, very small operating business or almost no operating business whatsoever, like I mentioned at the start, Semler does have a valuable real healthcare business that has been operating for many, many years before they adopted the Bitcoin treasury strategy. And so historically, the cash flows from the healthcare business have been used to purchase more Bitcoin. And if the healthcare business continues to be profitable going forward, then those cash flows also may be allocated to purchase more Bitcoin. And so, at a very high level, those are kind of the four key prongs that we're going to lean into to accumulate more Bitcoin. And kind of like I mentioned, there's maybe a dozen more that we're exploring and considering, but we haven't disclosed them publicly quite yet. So stay tuned for that.
Talking about Semler being an already established company that cemented itself in the medical industry, could you see potentially the overall direction of the company to move solely towards a Bitcoin standard, being a Bitcoin treasury company, when it doesn't make sense to keep the underlying medical business? Or does the underlying business intend to integrate Bitcoin into its business model beyond just the treasury itself, such as potential payments, mining, or any type of layer two integrations or engagement? What does that look like?
It's a really good question. As far as like integrating Bitcoin itself into the business beyond having a treasury component, payments, maybe that's something that we should consider exploring. As far as is Bitcoin outside a treasury lens, I think another way that we are actively thinking about it as operating on a Bitcoin standard is we're using Bitcoin as a hurdle rate for capital allocation. And so if there are internal projects within the medical business that we think could generate a higher return than holding spot Bitcoin itself, then that is a project that the company may decide to actually pursue. If something is forecasted to return less than Bitcoin itself or underperform holding spot Bitcoin, then that's something that the company would likely not try to pursue. And so I think just using Bitcoin as a lens for capital allocation within the existing company is something that the company is actively doing. Obviously, it strives to be cash flow positive in the sense that the healthcare business kind of just exists as it is today, and the cash flows that we hope to have received in the past and obviously hope to continue receiving in the future, those could be used to acquire more Bitcoin and likely will be used to acquire more Bitcoin. As far as spinning the medical business off, I think right now, like, it's something that I believe Eric has thought of in the past. I think at the moment, he's not really looking to pursue that. And I don't think that we will look to pursue that. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, I think having the medical business that has existed for many years before we adopted the Bitcoin standard for Semler Scientific, it has enabled us to generate cash flow to buy more Bitcoin. And then also, when you just think about trying to value Semler Scientific, you can think about it using like a basic sum of the parts analysis. So you would say, okay, Semler has maybe $500 million worth of Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and maybe $100 million medical business that's also on their balance sheet. And so when you think about this whole idea of issuing common equity and buying more Bitcoin, which again, like I mentioned, is kind of the entire playbook for how these Bitcoin treasury companies are buying more and more Bitcoin, having a real valuable operating business in addition to just a pretty large Bitcoin treasury is kind of what could help enable the market to ascribe a premium to the underlying Bitcoin on our balance sheet, which would then enable us to issue new shares, buy more Bitcoin, grow Bitcoin per share over time in an accretive manner for shareholders. So right now, I think the plan will be to keep it, but maybe we can start exploring some of those ideas that you mentioned.
And since as of late, everybody's aware that these Bitcoin treasury companies have been popping up left and right. Semler sort of is unique in its own, being the second corporate entity following strategy to do this Bitcoin treasury play. So it seems that we're going through a new phase of corporate Bitcoin adoption. Moving forward, what will distinguish leaders from late adopters over the next 2 to 3 years? And this is sort of a twofold question. Do you foresee an S&P 500 company Bitcoin wave by 2027?
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely like the second part of that question. Yeah, I mean, so far, to answer your first part, we have seen a number of different Bitcoin treasury companies come to market really all over the world, right? Like you have Nakamoto from David Bailey, basically trying to go around the world to a variety of different capital markets located in various geographic regions, and basically setting up these Bitcoin treasury like entities like Metaplanet or Strategy or others in the UK or Thailand or wherever else. And I think it's really good for Bitcoin that they're doing that. I think all of these companies, as you may have seen, they're starting to try to come up with unique ways to differentiate themselves compared to their competitors and kind of show like, hey, we are better because X, Y, and Z, and here's why. I think you'll continue to see different companies try to find like unique strategic edges on each other and kind of silo themselves into particular strategies that are different from their peers. Although I think at the end of the day, like how I'm thinking about these Bitcoin treasury companies is it's a unique way to amplify the future returns of Bitcoin. A lot of these Bitcoin treasury companies take on what Michael Saylor refers to as intelligent leverage. The way I've kind of been describing intelligent leverage is it's leverage that's maybe only available to publicly traded companies. And it's leverage in the sense that they can borrow at cheap interest rates compared to individual people. And then they can also borrow without having a short-term liquidation risk on the Bitcoin. So like, for example, if you're an individual or a hedge fund and you want to go leverage long Bitcoin on a futures market, a crypto futures market, for example, and you want to go 2x long Bitcoin, you would deposit Bitcoin as collateral. And then if Bitcoin falls 50% overnight, then they might liquidate your position, close it out. You lose all of your Bitcoin. And even if the next day Bitcoin goes back up to where it was right before, you lost all your Bitcoin. These Bitcoin treasury companies, a lot of them are structuring their debt in a way that if the price of Bitcoin falls significantly in the short term, they're not going to get called and liquidated in their position. They can ride it out over an extended period of time. And so the Bitcoin treasury companies could actually survive a significant, very short-term drawdown which is kind of like exactly what happened in March 2020 when the price of Bitcoin fell like 50% in one day and a lot of short-term leverage traders got wiped out. These Bitcoin treasury companies could actually survive that. And, as long as the price of Bitcoin continues to go up over the long run, it can survive these short-term volatility flush outs going forward. And so this whole idea of intelligent leverage is, I think, like what's making these Bitcoin treasury companies so interesting and appealing. And it's like you have people like Adam Back that say, and I agree with him, that say Bitcoin could approach a $200 trillion total market cap when the price of, the market cap of Bitcoin today might be $2 trillion. So that's 100x potential upside in the price of Bitcoin. How's that much capital, or how's, even a small percentage of that capital going to flow into Bitcoin and push the price significantly higher? And I think this idea of intelligent leverage is kind of like opening up the traditional capital markets to flow into Bitcoin via Bitcoin treasury company equity and Bitcoin treasury company debt in order to bring this new capital that they raise and buy Bitcoin. And I think this is kind of just how it's playing out and how it will probably continue playing out for the next decade or so. Putting a specific time frame on anything is very difficult. I would say I believe it's only a matter of time until it happens, as long as Bitcoin remains the best form of money that we have today because of its unique superior monetary properties. It seems like it's only a matter of time. And it's also not to say that it hasn't been happening, right? You have Square or Block now, Jack Dorsey's company. You have Tesla, and you have Coinbase. Those are three companies in the S&P 500 that have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. They're not, I wouldn't say they're on a Bitcoin standard like Strategy or Semler Scientific, but they are in the S&P 500 and they have purchased Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And I would expect more companies to follow them. And maybe they'll start to get more aggressive when it comes to allocating capital internally within the company, and maybe allocating more to Bitcoin, and maybe being a little bit more selective about which projects they're pursuing internally. And if they be more selective about which projects they pursue internally and how they deploy capital internally, then that capital that they may decide to not deploy could actually start being deployed into Bitcoin instead as their savings tool. So yeah, I think more and more S&P 500 companies will start buying Bitcoin. And I also think that, perhaps we'll see companies like Strategy get added into the S&P 500, and that might, also put a fire under some of the S&P 500 companies to kind of start copying their playbook.
I agree. It seems that when it comes to the Bitcoin treasury strategy, you're seeing some of the quote unquote zombie companies that are sort of popping up left and right globally. And it's eventually going to bubble up into the S&P when that becomes a standard there. And it's sort of the same thing we're seeing with some of the Bitcoin legislation is starting at the state level. States are passing it, then it'll bubble up to the federal level. So it's creating that baseline for overall Bitcoin adoption, which is definitely a good thing. So let's pivot over to some data points surrounding Semler Scientific. So you're seeing the MNAV discussion getting tossed around on the X spaces a lot in comparison to other Bitcoin treasury companies. There's some talks with Semler's MNAV being mispriced. Correct me if I'm misspeaking, closer to like a 1 MNAV. So why do you feel that the premium is in parity with the actual company's valuation versus some of these other Bitcoin treasury companies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You look at Strategy right now, they may be trading at a 1.8x MNAV. Metaplanet was trading at a maybe 8x or 10x in MNAV at one point. I think now, like today, last I checked, it's down to 4. Semler right now, maybe about 1.3 or 1.25. There's obviously also various ways to calculate the MNAV, which is an interesting discussion too. But and so Semler's has been a little bit lower compared to some of the other peers that are building these Bitcoin treasury companies. I think Eric has said, and he probably would agree with this still, is that in the past, Semler has done maybe not as good of a job as they could have at about communicating their strategy and what they're doing to the Bitcoin community. And I think that's kind of why they decided to bring Natalie Brunell on the board and then appoint me as director of Bitcoin strategy. And I think that what I'm trying to do as part of my role is, one, help articulate our strategy to the Bitcoin community, and then two, trying to come up with new strategic objectives and frameworks and tactics that we can use to create stockholder value and to meet our Bitcoin accumulation target goals. Like I mentioned earlier, we have the four key prongs that I touched on earlier of how we intend to reach our Bitcoin accumulation targets. And as far as like where we trade right now relative to others, I probably can't comment too much publicly on like how our current stock price is trading. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to see how these different companies trade relative to each other. And I think, like, broadly speaking, one of the reasons why I decided to join a Bitcoin treasury company is I think these companies are interesting even at various different MNAV valuations, right? If a company trades at above 1x MNAV, which is at the moment almost every Bitcoin treasury company, because it's a bull market and demand for these companies is hot. Well, all of these companies, including Semler, can issue equity, buy Bitcoin, and that's accretive to the common equity shareholders as the Bitcoin per share increases after that transaction. Now, what's also interesting is, let's say all of these companies trade at 1x MNAV, meaning it's in line with the value of the Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Yes, they can't just issue equity and buy Bitcoin and immediately generate BTC yield, unfortunately, which is like a great flywheel that currently exists for almost every Bitcoin treasury company. But you still get that leverage long Bitcoin exposure, and you're not buying it at a premium, right? So there's kind of a con to buying companies when they trade at a high MNAV multiple, right? Like you're paying a premium for the underlying Bitcoin. Now it's likely because that they're generating a lot of Bitcoin yield, and that's good for them, and that's potentially good for shareholders if that can continue. But it's also potentially okay or still interesting if these companies trade at 1x MNAV, because they could be basically like a 1.2x long Bitcoin position with a low interest rate and no short-term liquidation risk, which would, effectively amplify the future returns of Bitcoin. And if you're bullish on Bitcoin over a long time horizon, then that could be an interesting opportunity. And then the third way of framing is like, okay, well, what if MNAV actually goes below 1? Well, in that case, it's still kind of actually interesting, because then you can acquire some of these companies at a discount to the underlying Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin's trading at 100,000 or whatever it might be at the time, you could actually be effectively buying leveraged Bitcoin at a discount to the current price of Bitcoin. And so I think it's like these Bitcoin treasury companies, no matter what valuation that they're trading at, if you have a long time horizon on how you think about the future of Bitcoin, all of these different valuation ranges could be interesting, just given what you're trying to accomplish with your investments, how much volatility you're willing to tolerate, and how much risk you're willing to tolerate. So at a high level, that's kind of how I think about the MNAV calculation for these Bitcoin treasury companies right now.
So let's talk about the acquisition. Semler's been acquiring its current Bitcoin holdings, like we had mentioned, using the ATM, convertible debts, its cash flow, and soon to be sometime in the future, some preferred equity potentially. So with all of that, you got the targets of 10,000 Bitcoin by the end of 2025, which are almost 50% the way there, and 105,000 Bitcoin by the end of 2027. So these are extremely aggressive targets. We're seeing some other aggressive targets from companies across the globe as well. So how do you approach risk in this strategy, and how do you plan to prepare when the next drawdown comes for Bitcoin? A lot of people are saying that this time's different, and we've heard that time and time again from cycle to cycle. And this time's different until it's not. So if we do get that euphoric blow off top and then that bear market comes in, what does that look like, and how do you prepare for that for Semler's Bitcoin treasury strategy moving forward?
Yeah, risk management is a really interesting topic, I think, when it comes to Bitcoin treasury companies. And I think a lot of people have been skeptical of these Bitcoin treasury companies for various reasons. One obvious one is the idea of leverage in Bitcoin historically has never been a really good combination, right? You take a very volatile asset and you pair it with mark to market leverage. It's kind of a disaster waiting to happen, as we saw, like I mentioned, on March 2020 when Bitcoin fell 50% in one day. If you had a leveraged Bitcoin position on something like BitMEX, you probably got liquidated and you lost all your Bitcoin. And that happened to many people and even many funds. With public companies, kind of like I mentioned, it adds another degree of risk management and more certainty around the debt that you're borrowing to acquire more Bitcoin. Like I mentioned, if Bitcoin falls 99% tomorrow and then pops back up to where it is today, like the following day, these Bitcoin treasury companies, obviously their stock would crash in the short term, but they wouldn't go to zero overnight. And if it popped back up to where it was today, then it would probably be trading, maybe around near where it's trading right now. Whereas if you took a leverage position on Bitcoin on a futures exchange, you would have been wiped out and went to zero, no matter if Bitcoin actually did pop back up to where it was trading. And so I think that the way that the debt of these companies is structured, it adds another degree of of safety that hasn't existed before when it comes to leverage Bitcoin position effectively. Additionally, on that, the duration of the debt is a little bit different from what we've historically experienced when it comes to taking a leverage position on Bitcoin. For example, Semler Scientific, the convertible note that they issued earlier this year, it's not due until 2030. So that's 5 years from now. If Bitcoin falls 80% and it stays down 80% for 5 years, then Semler and many other Bitcoin treasury companies would probably be in trouble, right? But if Bitcoin is $20,000 in 2030, then perhaps we misallocated capital to begin with, and perhaps something is wrong with Bitcoin itself, or the thesis was potentially incorrect. And so if you're willing to take that 4 to 5 year time horizon, and you're willing to go through some pretty intense volatility, then I think these Bitcoin treasury companies are actually pretty interesting. I think Strategy has done this, and Semler is thinking about this in a very similar manner as well. Strategy targets their debt to Bitcoin net asset value ratio to be about 20 to 30%. So that means, let's say you have $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, then you want to have maybe $200 billion worth of debt to maintain that 20% leverage ratio. And if you actually think about this and compare it to something like real estate's kind of the opposite, where it's like you actually only put 20% down and then you borrow the 80%, kind of the opposite of Bitcoin treasury companies. You're highly leveraged in the real estate industry and many other industries. And so in a way, the Bitcoin treasury company industry is a lot less leveraged than many other industries. Now, Bitcoin is extremely volatile, and so that's part of the reason why many of these companies are taking a more conservative leverage position or more conservative leverage ratio. But I think that that's a key point to be made when it comes to how's the risk management of these companies, going to differ, and how is it going to survive these intense drawdowns? Well, it's because they're not taking on too much leverage. And we saw this in 2020 when Bitcoin had a pretty serious bear market. I think it fell either 80 or 79%, or 76%, one of those three. And MicroStrategy survived. We saw BlockFi that failed, Celsius failed, FTX failed, Three Arrows Capital failed. A lot of these perceived, intelligent crypto institutions that were trying to do some sort of sophisticated financial engineering, they, failed and were either too leveraged or committed actual fraud or whatever else. Whereas MicroStrategy, yes, the stock price fell significantly, but it didn't go to zero, and it actually recovered, dramatically relative to what it was at the peak of the last cycle. And so I think that seeing one of these Bitcoin treasury companies go through a real serious bear market and then come out the other end, more successful than ever before, I think is a promising sign for a lot of these Bitcoin treasury companies, as long as they maintain conservative amounts of leverage and don't get in over their heads.
100% agree. So with you being the newly appointed director of the Bitcoin Treasury strategy at Semler, let's fast forward to 2027. What would you define as your benchmark for success for the given Bitcoin strategy, both in terms of corporate performance, but also Bitcoin's role in the economy?
Well, one of my main goals is to obviously hit our Bitcoin accumulation target. So reaching 105,000 Bitcoin by the end of 2027. And I definitely think that, we can do that with the steps that I've outlined and the other ideas and strategies that we're discussing internally. As far as Bitcoin, in 2027, I tend to believe that we're still incredibly early in the global monetization of Bitcoin. I think most people really aren't paying attention to it at all. And I think most people saving for the future or investing for the future are kind of just sleepwalking, even people within traditional finance themselves. And I think the Bitcoin treasury company phenomenon is kind of how the next wave of capital just naturally starts chasing Bitcoin. It's going to be via the stock market and the credit market, which these Bitcoin treasury companies are issuing securities in both of those markets. And so I expect to probably see, continued flows from those two massive markets into Bitcoin through Bitcoin treasury companies. So I expect that to be a trend that continues. And I expect, by the end of 2027, for the price of Bitcoin to be significantly higher than it is today.
Let's transition that into the price of Bitcoin talk. What's your personal projections by the end of this year and fast forward 5 years out? I know it's hard to tell, but what's your price predictions?
I've always said that short-term Bitcoin price predictions are incredibly difficult, if not impossible. I think I've been on the record publicly stating, obviously not financial advice, and it's more of a hypothesis that I think we could be entering the over the next 12 months or perhaps the rest of this year, entering like the parabolic phase of the current Bitcoin bull market. In a way, 2023, 2024, and the first half of 2025. It's been 2.5 years of a pretty solid Bitcoin bull market, which is great, but we haven't quite seen the massive exponential move that has occasionally ended a lot of these Bitcoin bull runs, where Bitcoin just goes absolutely crazy for a relatively short period of time, and then it corrects a little bit after it unsustainably went up so much. I think we could be on the cusp of that exponential parabolic move, and perhaps that sends Bitcoin to $250,000 in the next 6 to 12 months. I think that's on the table. There's obviously no guarantee that happens, and you should position yourself, to not expect that, or to have the risk management principles in place to where you're not reliant on that happening. And so that's kind of where I see it over the relatively short term. Longer term or medium term, thinking about 5 years, so that would be about 2030. By then, I wouldn't be too surprised to see Bitcoin trading at around gold parity, right? I think gold is roughly a $20 trillion asset. Bitcoin is currently a $2 trillion asset. For Bitcoin to just reach gold parity, that means Bitcoin needs to do a 10x in its total market size, which would put Bitcoin roughly at about $1 million per Bitcoin. And the reason I think that is because, well, one, gold is kind of like it's a monetary asset, but I would argue Bitcoin is actually significantly better than gold. It's more scarce. It's portable over the internet. It's infinitely divisible. Gold is kind of this like old monetary technology that a few people around the world and central banks and governments still use as a non-sovereign, global neutral asset that doesn't have counterparty risk, and it serves a very niche, purpose in the global financial system. And I view Bitcoin as a form of digital gold that, very easily, in my mind, could reach gold parity and likely eventually succeeded by multiple or even an order of magnitude. I think if you look back at other technology innovations like Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and you compare it to the iPhone today, it's like, is the iPhone just as valuable as Alexander Graham Bell's original telephone? Well, no, obviously. Like the iPhone is magnitudes more valuable, or Apple is magnitudes more valuable than Alexander Graham Bell's original telephone. I view Bitcoin as kind of a similar 0 to 1 innovation, to where it's not just going to match the current value of gold, it's going to potentially exceed it by an order of magnitude or two. And so, yeah, I mean, I think by 2030, it's definitely possible that Bitcoin could be about $1 million per coin or even higher by that point.
Definitely agree. So, what closing thoughts should our viewers have if they're interested in finding more about Semler, finding more about what's going on there? Where can they find you at? Closing thoughts.
Yeah, Sean, thanks for inviting me on. It's obviously great to talk about Bitcoin and Semler. If you want to learn more about Semler, you can obviously follow me or Semler Scientific on Twitter. For me, I'm at III Capital on Twitter, or you can type in Joe Burnett. You can type in Semler Scientific on Twitter, follow Semler there. Another cool resource that I like to send people to is ir.semlerscientific.com. It's basically a dashboard that you can see all of the metrics for Semler Scientific. You can see how much Bitcoin we currently hold. You can see the current stock price. You can see our MNAV multiple, and a bunch of other really cool metrics that I'm looking at every single day. So definitely check us out on Twitter. You can also find me on YouTube. I'm at Joe Burnett 27, I believe, on YouTube, or you can just type in Joe Burnett Bitcoin. But those are kind of the spots where you can find me and Semler Scientific.